So I think humanitarian agencies, until the last sort of 10, 15 years, have tended to be very, very cautious and circumspect in their engagement with faith-based communities and religion as a theme. And I think that they've chosen to, in a sense, keep an arm's length relationship, as they would imagine, to religion and faith-based communities and faith-based organisations, on the basis of justifying that it's not a primary material need for people in displacement context. So I think there's been a largely relationship of kind of fear and distrust in secular humanitarianism towards religion and towards faith-based actors. Now, interestingly, I think that in essence what that means is that religion is then very often both politicised in secular humanitarianism and also racialised. So it's certain religious identities and actors where it's tied to racialised identities that become particularly problematised in secular humanitarian work. I also think, and I think Olivia Wilkinson's work is hugely important here, that one of the things we need to do in terms of thinking about how secular humanitarian organisations view religion is actually to put a different category under the spotlight and to ask, how does ideas about the secular or secularity have an influence over the action of humanitarian organisations? It's not only religious groups and faith-based organisations who have some kind of values-based identity or who operate within what we might call loosely belief systems. What they operate within is supposedly, as they would describe it, a kind of neutral, liberal worldview that prioritises the idea of impartiality, neutrality, accountability. Now, in reality, for many refugee and local host communities in refugee displacement situations, they would not describe the way that secular humanitarian organisations appear in their localities as neutral or impartial. So I think there's very often a gap between how local faith-based communities experience secular humanitarian actors and the narratives, the belief systems that those organisations use themselves. And we do need to own up to the fact that the history of 20th century and now 21st century humanitarianism is bound up with belief and value narratives. There are ideas of salvation with a small s that are written through humanitarianism already, and it's helpful to be able to kind of look at those. I also think that particularly in terms of the region that we've been working in, so working in Jordan, in Lebanon and Turkey, the reality is that there are very different ways of understanding faith and religious identities in relation to humanitarianism in those contexts. So very often when I was interviewing people in faith-based organisations in Jordan, they would be absolutely bewildered at the idea that they needed to sort of separate off something that was obviously faith action, religious action, as opposed to a general responsiveness from organisations, because they would see that they operated with a much more holistic understanding of their identity as Jordanians, and in the majority of cases, but not all, as Muslims. And so they rejected this idea of something that was a distinguishable religious feature to their humanitarian response. There was simply a humanitarian response which had religious elements to it. So I think we need to be sort of careful about the way that we distinguish faith or not as part of that. Now, in other contexts that we were working in, for example, Lebanon, it was really important to distinguish where something had a directly religious component to it because of the particular historical contextual issues that we found in the faith-based and humanitarian sector in Lebanon, and much more a context in which those identities were much more politicised and at stake in a different kind of a way. What religion and faith-based communities have are deep narratives of humanitarianism, not defined according to the register of 20th century humanitarian secular movements necessarily, but religious organisations and faith communities are thoroughly humanitarian organisations, i.e. they are interested in questions of human purpose, human meaning, human responsiveness, responsibilities and obligations and duties of mutual care. And they have narratives, very, very vibrant narratives about risk, about suffering and about survival. So in that sense, they are essentially humanitarian actors themselves for the very reason that they combine both a belief system and a set of actions and practices around those issues. And that is not well understood, I think, across the humanitarian secular sector. The first is obviously reception fast mobilisation in contexts of emergency, as well as stable, enduring communities of response for transition and solution finding. So faith-based organisations, faith-based communities stay around. They were around before the crisis. They tend to remain in areas during a crisis, and they are there afterwards. So that capacity for fast mobilisation and for enduring connection is profoundly important. Hospitality and hosting, basic practices of both bodily care, material care, but also psychosocial care, and an ongoing kind of psychological identity-based process of engagement is crucial. And I think one of the things often that secular humanitarian agencies fail to spot is how important trust is. Relationships of trust make politics work, business work, and they make humanitarianism work or not work as well. And in the absence of those relationships of trust, it can be difficult to build cohesive community in response to emergency or a protracted situation. And I think faith-based communities can be vital to fostering those relationships of trust. So they're networks of relationship, of relationality and care. They're structured contexts. They have buildings, forms of social capital. But interestingly, they're often almost also more informal as care actors. And I think one of the things that refugee communities newly arrived often appreciate is the fact that the care can be more informal. It feels less bureaucratic and less contractual. And I think there's a sense in which that builds dignity into the process for many refugee arriving communities. The other thing that I think faith-based communities and faith-based organisations can provide is kind of a bridging relationships function. And that works in two ways. I think it works in the first instance because often religious communities, faith-based communities can reach inaccessible communities that secular humanitarian bigger actors who are not so well embedded in the area and don't have those relationships of trust can't reach. And that's crucial. And I think that's simply an international dynamic. The second is that they have bridging relationships outwards. They tend to be part of bigger networks, not in all cases, it depends on the nature of the religious group, the faith-based actor, but they often have these connections and deep relationships outwards that can be international, global, or may well be regional and may well themselves cross borders. And that can often be really critical in terms of building bridging relationships that are necessary for good response. I think the other thing is that faith communities can provide often a context for dialogue, and that can be between groups where there's tensions or potential or actual conflict, but also simply where a crisis or a new situation arises and you need dialogue and you need solutions and you need the buy-in of the community, then faith-based organisations and groups can provide a context for that. It is obviously true that faith-based organisations and communities can also be problematic contexts in terms of refugee response, and we know that from our own research and from other research in the field. But just to note that obviously an embedded local faith-based organisation can also be highly politicised as a context. So just to make sure it doesn't sound also too romantic in the account I'm giving. One of the things that needs to shift most is the power imbalances that are felt within refugee and within local host communities vis-a-vis larger humanitarian agencies. And anything that offers a better understanding of faith and faith-based humanitarian action has to address and be interested in those questions of power imbalances. A better understanding of faith and faith-based humanitarianism offers the opportunity for better responses in terms of disaster risk prevention. They're contexts which can build the social solidarity that's then enacted in a situation of necessary hospitality or of displacement. And again, many of the blog pieces based on empirical research on our Refugee Hosts site talk again and again about the prior social solidarity, the thickness of those social relations that means it's possible to be quickly responsive and therefore not to need to use the language of crisis, which again is, I think, a very sort of Western secular humanitarian politicised language to describe the events of displacement that occur. But there's a real opportunity, if you engage faith and faith communities well, for capacity building within communities. So again, one of the things we were interested in this project from the very beginning was the way in which local host communities, which include previous generations of refugees, within them in all the countries that we were working in, the way in which you need an integrated community-based response within localities. Genuine capacity building through engaging faith in those contexts will help with that. It gives better long-term solutions in intractable situations. And we know that the duration of refugeedom at the moment is on the increase. So that seems to matter even more. If we want responses to refugee displacement that are about doing things with people, not to them or for them, then it's an absolute no-brainer that better understandings of faith and faith-based communities need to be part of that. It's how you build, as I was saying before, dialogue, trust, and real enduring solutions.